All right, so don't currently have anybody with us, but I am going to go ahead and start my presentation here without further ado. So that way we'll have it for the future. It'll be there, and yeah, maybe if it's useful to somebody, then it'll be there. Okay, so the presentation I'm going to make today is called Scope in Your Project. So it's a pretty relevant subject in my mind because starting out as a beginner game builder or programmer of whatever sort, oftentimes the things that get us are related to scope. Our projects are too ambitious and what have you. So what is scope? It is sort of that broader picture, the most top level view of your project when you're asking, what is it going to be? What are the essential features? If there's like a Venn diagram of what it does, that's kind of like scope. If your app has a store, that's gonna expand the scope of your project. All this sort of thing. Okay, so with that, I think I can move beyond my title slide here, and I have scope in your project and overview. So we can start with this, as usual, dry outline of what I'm going to cover here. But why not? So this will just give me an opportunity to speak a little bit on each one of these points, and then we'll go through. Scope. The reason we're talking about it is because it's often the downfall of the novice programmer project. It's something that I've experienced many times, which we will be going through. I'll show you a few of the both failures from past projects, and I'll give you a little look at how scope has factored into the project that I'm currently working on. There's a decision there that affected the scope, and I would say made it hopefully manageable at this juncture, whereas it might not have been. Scope is also, it's kind of something as far as like the novice programmer, it's something that I've had a view on both personally and through, in my experience moderating for 2 years on the Code Academy community Facebook group. I've seen a lot of new programmers come in as I came into that group not long after I had finished this intensive. At that time, Code Academy was doing these intensives, which would be like a 2-month course where you would learn certain focused skills, which in this case was build websites from scratch. So I learned HTML, CSS, and a bit of JavaScript. I think a little bit of jQuery on top of that. So I come into this community group in this frame and this point of view. And at that time, I think just like I've seen so many people come into there with around that same area of personal development as a programmer, thinking that we're going to make, an app that's comparable to something that we see out there on the market. And you just don't know. You don't know how much work that is. You don't understand that you're not ready, but you have that ambition and that contrast between your ambition and your lack of understanding about how much work it takes to do things is what causes scope to be this sort of failing ground for many beginner programmers. And it holds true with games or any other area of programming. So as we're debating ideas for features, as well as, because of you have your idea for the app in general, and then you have, within an app, you could throw in features, what have you. So as we're debating ideas for features, there's a tendency towards adding rather than taking away or simplifying. And this is something that I also experienced in 4 years as a creative writing major in college. Like I went through a lot of creative writing workshops and experience through my own experience with revising was often that when revising, the tendency was to add things. And it was a lot harder to take things away or simplify, but most of the time, I would say with my most successful stories, it was the fact that it was a success was a result of simplifying. You know, taking this 30-page thing and cutting out all the fat, and then what do you have? You know, maybe something that's 6 pages. It's good. Anyway, stories to the side. Obviously, we're talking about programming here, but it's still easy. You know, as a creative, when you're thinking creatively, it's more compelling to add things. You know, because it's exciting. It's going to do all these things. You know, but everything that you want it to do is a feature that you have to make. And so, anyway, let me move on to my next point. If we don't have development experience, we might not understand how adding features will affect the amount of work required, which is basically what I've been talking about. I've just kind of been getting out of line and dipping into one point or another. So the way this goes, okay, adding a feature may cause exponential increase in development costs. So it's not always linear, you know, it depends on, well, let's just go with the examples that I have here. So increasing the resolution of models or skins, right? So if you increase the resolution of your models, say you double the detail in your models. You know, now if you have 300 models, then you know, every model is going to take, you know, twice as long to make. And then if you then decide you want to double the number of models, not only do you have double the number of models, but then now you also have double the amount of work for each model because they have increased resolution, what have you. Adding stats and leveling. So every unit needs stats for each possible level, you know, and then say you do that and then you decide to add another stat, then you have to go through every item that you had and every, you know, then let's say you decide to add, you have stats and leveling, and then you decide you want to make multiplayer. Classic gaff in my development experience is very difficult to do, at least by comparison to a single player game. And then let's say you have stats and leveling, but now you want to do multiplayer. Maybe now not only do you have to develop multiplayer, but you have to develop a completely different statistical growth model for multiplayer in order to balance around multiplayer, because your single player design might be unbalanced and you can't have that for multiplayer. So you know, there's so many ways for a simple decision to lead to spiraling development time. Spiraling, exponentially increasing, I think is what I mean to say. So my first example of scope is from my first attempt to make a game, which I started back in 1997. I was making this in Unity 3D with C Sharp. Really too ambitious of a project. My basic idea was like, oh, I'll do a Diablo style game where you fly around with a spaceship and you know, you fight enemies in space. So let me just play this. I have a little clip that I took from uh, up the sound on so you can hear the sound effects. So this is not like this was basically a demo, demonstration level. It was only just basically positioned some number of things, objects that game objects that had scripts and all of this without any sort of starting or ending game logic. So pretty far from the concept, which envisioned as like this Diablo style game, which I, you know, total pie in the sky. I wanted it to be like a Diablo style game that you play with a spaceship, but have like base invasion aspects. Like I was thinking of like Red Alert 2 when you like try to break down the defenses of an enemy base and all this kind of thing. And then like I think at some point in time when I was working on it, I was like entertaining the thought of it somehow working like a MOBA, you know, just as I was stating in that outline, just like adding more stuff, which was completely at odds with like my actual work and progress on it. Because like basically, as I said, I only really produced this one um, static area, which I, you know, at the same time, I was kind of proud of in retrospect, but it wasn't complete by any means. So lessons I took from this, attempting to combine multiple genres, attempting a type of game which is too big for a solo project or a first game attempt. I didn't know any design pattern, which is why this was just like this kind of thing that ran, but wasn't really um, prepared in any way to scale or, you know, I I was really just like focusing on being able to do something. So let me move on to this scope in your project. So let's focus this idea on what can you take away? How can you look at your own current projects or prospective projects and take some thought that you can actually act on in regards to scope. So why is it tempting to add more? Let's talk about the why. Well, it's kind of obvious. It feels exciting to feel like we're working on a big, important project. Not unlike how you have writers, you know, and every writer is writing the great American novel, right? But you have to write some short stories before you can write the great American novel. If the first thing you sit down to write is the great American novel, then it's probably not going to be great. Probably not even going to end up being a novel. So in terms of game development, it's exciting to think about the end result being relevant somehow. But if it's your first game and you don't have any real programming experience, that might be asking a bit much. You know, it's going to be hard to determine how, like, what you can actually do. But that's it's probably in that regard. If it's really your first project, it's better to just try anyway. But let me move on. Let's talk about a scope pitfall. Adding scope that requires you to learn a new skill. You could look at this from a lens of just asking, are you ready to build the kind of game that you want to make? Let's say you do want to build that Diablo style game. You know, you break down all the skills that are going to be involved in making that. It might be best to make some small project with each one of these skills before you're trying to combine them all into one large project, because the time required to add in learning this new skill while you make this large project is going to throw you off. Personally, I find that every project has its own kind of life and lifetime, and if you wait too long, if you drag your feet too much, if you don't make time to work on it, or if other things get in the way, after a certain amount of time, the project is just going to die. Your own familiarity with it will wane, and perhaps at some point you'll just come back to the project and realize, like, why am I doing this? It's not really happening. It's DOA. So that's a pitfall to adding scope that requires you to learn a new skill. The example would be like if you want to add a back end, but you need to learn back end, you might end up spending 2 months learning back end, and that's going to derail your project because by then you don't even know what you were doing, and again, it's hard to recognize that might be the case sometimes because, again, we have the enthusiasm well, it's easy to make everything sound good because it's like the way it's so easy to see it is, it's a win-win. I'm going to learn a new skill that's valuable. I always hear people talking about back end. It's going to be great. I'm going to learn back end, then I'm going to add that into my project, and the reality ends up being, in that enthusiasm, you underestimate how much time it's really going to learn, and having this goal of adding it to your project in the background is probably going to cause you to not have maybe the patience that you should have trying to learn this new skill. You may end up just fumbling both attempts. You don't really give yourself the time or patience or headspace to learn the new skill, and then you've wasted so much time that you don't actually finish the project. It just ends up going off the rails. So again, that comes back to my scope tip. Try to learn new skills between projects, not as part of them. That does require some restraint in sort of giving into the desire to add new features to a game. And I promise you, every game that I've ever made, there were always more things that I thought about doing with it that I didn't. And ultimately, sometimes, especially when you're just starting out and you're learning more skills, it's better to just move on rather than to add more to it. So I have another example of this type of scope derailment that I'm talking about. So I'll play this video here again. This is another project that I made. It's a breakout game. So it allows you to make levels, and then you can launch those levels and play those levels, which was kind of neat. It was a fun project. It took me several months to make this, and there were a lot of challenges. I made the game itself in JavaScript, and I made the editor where you can make levels. I made that in React, and then like kind of tied it all together in React. But what happened was when I got to a certain point with this, I wanted to be able to make another app where users could share those levels with each other and like rate those levels and all this sort of thing. So the issue there was that around a certain point, I said, okay, well, let me learn back end. And I spent about 2 months learning back end, which was pretty dispiriting because I really wasn't enjoying learning back end at that point. I kind of just wanted to work on a project, and I was doing these tutorials for learning back end that I wasn't enjoying, and I just I think I ended up getting burned out on coding altogether. So this project kind of lost momentum and didn't go any further. And eventually I did come back a little, I guess, refreshed and learned more back end. But yeah, it definitely was just not happening in this particular case that I could add that feature because again, it required me to learn a skill. So let me talk. I will briefly discuss something from my current project, which is, in theory, it's a game where you play as an RPG vendor, and it's like a lemonade stand simulation style game where you sell items to adventurers that go through a dungeon, and they might buy they might buy your items, and so forth and so on, and in theory, in some way, that might affect their abilities to succeed in the dungeon. Now, before I ever started on this game, I had considered different ways of doing it, and I was thinking about it long before I had the ability to do it, which I didn't know at the time. But one of the ways that I thought about doing it was for the dungeon, to generate maps, like some kind of roguelike, or I think what I was kind of thinking of was something like this game, Azure Dreams, which was released for the PlayStation. I think it was a Konami RPG, and it was released for the PlayStation, and they made another version for the Game Boy Color. But I was thinking like maps like that, or just, generally like mazes or whatever, and like come up with some way to procedurally generate those, but then I would have to write scripts for the adventurers to navigate it because they'd have to know when they're at a wall and all this kind of thing. So that's sort of a literalistic way of thinking about how to uh, produce the requirements of this dungeon, which, as I thought about it, all I really needed was to simulate the results of a dungeon. So when I decided, what if I just say, almost like a board game, let's say these adventurers go into the dungeon, and based on some stat that they have, they can take a certain number of steps, which I think, as I was recently trying to do it, I was a little helped out by the fact that I've been playing board games lately. So I was thinking of stuff like Mansions of Madness, or what was the other one? House on Haunted Hill, where you have movement, so you can move so many tiles, and so it could be kind of similar like that. And then I could just randomly decide, okay, this, now they hit some treasure, now they ran into a monster, without having to actually have anything consistent, because I could just say, it's like a roguelike, So basically, that's just talking about like creating probabilities, um, you know, and just tables of probabilities, which is going to ultimately end up being a lot simpler than both coming up with a way to procedurally generate two-dimensional maps and then add logic and scripts to these adventures, which you might want to have variations. You might need several different scripts to allow them to navigate the map in different ways. So it's like, okay, we don't need to see the map. It's fine. Let's just show the results. So moving on, scope and action. What can you make? Let's see. This is how can you bring discussion about scope, or your own thinking about scope, to your own projects, your own development attempts, and actually take action on some awareness of scope. So let's say, what can you make with the skills you have? Whatever you know how to do now, what can you make with that? Maybe it's a simpler game than what you'd like to make, but you know, you're just talking about, you know, failing at your dream project versus just being able to actually do something. Either way can be a good learning experience, but if you want to start finishing things, it's probably good to try to look at what you can do with the skills you have. So how can you, moving on, how can you push your skills to get a challenge but not a crushing defeat? So this is trying to stay in that sweet spot. You don't want to do a game that's not going to be assuming that your goal is to grow as a game developer. So this is pretty oriented towards people who are just starting out. If you're, it might actually be advantageous not to push your skills too much if you are, say, if you've already made games, you're trying to make games for a market, you know, then you have to satisfy certain expectations. It's not necessarily good to do something totally different. But that's neither here nor there, because I am, if you were in that scenario, what can I tell you? I'm less skilled than that theoretical person, so there's no point in discussing that. So let's just say, how can you push your skills a little bit, but not too much? And that's something that you might really just learn from experience. You might just, maybe we all have to have our sort of crushing defeat. But it's something that you could start thinking about if you're finding that you've done several projects. What is the appropriate amount to push your skill level? If you're thinking of adding skills before starting the project, have you practiced your current skills enough? So this is just kind of about pacing yourself. I take my web development as an example. If I've just learned JavaScript, then it might not be good to try to do a ton of crazy stuff. You have to practice the concepts that you do know. It's just about gradually adding complexity to what you do. So you're not trying to take this sort of meteoric rise, basically it's just about getting practice. I don't know that I'm saying anything concrete about that. If you add a feature, will it increase your scope linearly or exponentially? I don't know why I had to throw in words that were going to be hard to pronounce into my presentation, but such is life. So this is really just, I guess, something where you have to think about is it going to affect other things, because like the examples that I discussed before, sometimes when you add something, it means now you need one of those for every of the other things that you had. So those are decisions that have to be taken more carefully because things just balloon out of control. So how much is too much? Pushing your skills. That's the words on the slide. So I'm reading it. How much will you need to learn? How do you know how much it will take? It's a good question, because a lot of times we don't know. So here's a way to attempt to answer it. Because it's better to try to take an educated guess, I would say, than to just say I don't know. So let's just whatever. So if you don't know, think about how long it took you to learn another skill, a comparable skill, if you have a comparable skill to whatever it is that you're trying to learn. So for instance, I would say, front end probably took me, if I'm talking about HTML and CSS, probably took me a couple months to kind of get a handle on it with basic JavaScript. So if I was going to say, well, now I want to learn, React, I want to learn this framework. Well, it's going to take you probably 2 months to learn, say, React and Redux. And then you say you want to learn backend. Well, it's probably going to take you. That's a difficult one to say because backend is a very nebulous. Let's just say you want to learn Express and some database skill. It might take 2 or 3 months, because again, you're just taking, how long did it take me to learn a similarly large skill? Okay, if it took me 2 months, it might take me 2 months to learn this skill. So avoid just saying, man, I'm sure I'll learn it quickly, because that's probably, it's just your enthusiasm for getting into it, whatever, that's deluding you. Consider making a small practice project with the new skill before taking on the bigger project. That's just giving you kind of a proof of concept that you are competent with the project. You're giving yourself a chance to work out the kinks, because every time you move into a new area of with a new skill, there's certain growth pains. You're going to make mistakes, and it would be better for a large project that's already going to contain a lot of complications and setbacks and all that sort of thing, to just avoid including those growing pains and that, all that entails. So, scope, conclusion. Try to base the decision to add a new feature on how much work it will add, rather than on how awesome you feel it would be. Obviously, that requires you to have some idea of how much work it would add, but that's one area where I would recommend some sort of code journal or something like that. Personally, I have started to get some idea of how long it takes me to do things, based off of a couple things that I've done. So I used to do a couple of weekly posts in this Codecademy community Facebook group, where like I had a Makers Monday post where I'd encourage people to set goals, and I would always participate in that. So I'd be setting goals, and then I had a Feel Good Friday post where I would just talk about what I accomplished. So I was able to go back through and look at those things and get a timeline to see, like, okay, here's how long it took me to make this thing. Here's how long it took me to learn this thing. And sometimes it's longer than you think, sometimes it's not as long as you think. But when you start tracking that, you get an idea of like, okay, I made a new component that took like a week. So now I know if I'm saying I want to make this component, it might take me a week, and that's, um, I have, it's big. I have a lot of examples for myself where I created paralysis in my process because I, said, well, the next thing I want to do is this thing, create this module, and it turned out that was like a month of work, but I just expected myself to get it done in one weekend. And like, I think I sat down for like a minute trying to find a way into it, gave up, and like ended up not coding for 2 weeks till I finally was like, all right, let's just start diagramming and breaking this thing down, because clearly I don't know how to even begin to approach it, And eventually, as I broke it down, I was able to make progress. But this is again how it can be that you, without experience, don't really have a hard time figuring out how much work something is going to be. So anyway, that's the first item on here about basing the decision to add a feature on how much work it will add. So whether or not the game would be cool, it won't exist if you can't actually make it, which is a good point. But when you're first starting out, you probably, again, you just have that sort of beginner's enthusiasm. You may not realize that you can't make it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if you don't make it, but it would be if you allowed that to make you give up on making games at all, or you just didn't get very far with it. The further you get with whatever you do, the more you're going to learn from it. It's not a bad thing to fail. It's just a matter of whether you take a learning experience from that failure. Anyway, so it's pretty obvious anyway. The game is not going to exist if you can't make it. So ignoring the concept of trying to figure out how much work it is going to be and going on pure enthusiasm may well ultimately result in just a mess, and crash and burn in the game doesn't happen. So make smaller projects to use with learning new skills. Then you can make the larger projects when you have experience with the needed skills. So again, that is kind of just about keeping those growing pains and the pain points in learning out of the project process, because kind of as I said, every project has its own life and lifeline and lifetime, and all these setbacks are just opportunities for burnout to ensue. They're things that throw you off your hopeful timeline for when you want to get things done, and just introduce frustration into your project process and what have you. So it's just more ways of inviting failure. So I do recommend to practice those new concepts and new skills with practice projects before tackling the big one. All right, so that is my discussion on scope. Thank you for joining me in theory.